Apple just bought Intel's modem business. What could this possibly mean for their future? Luckily, some of you on Twitter have said that you would like me to make a video on this, so I know just a big business decision is something you guys want to talk about. So that's what we're talking about today. Let's begin. I think most people have been fairly supportive of this idea. Whenever I see replies to it and whenever I see people reporting on it, I'm glad that the majority of people out there aren't just thinking, oh, Intel's modems were not as good as Qualcomm's, therefore this is going to be bad because all of those teams that made not so great modems will now be under Apple making bad modems forever. Luckily, a lot of you have seemed to be smarter than that and understand that when those teams, when these 2,200 people, 2,200 jobs are being switched over, which is a lot, by the way, plus $1 billion to buy it off of Intel in the first place. Once they're under the control of Apple, they're going to be managed differently, they're going to have different deadlines, and probably be worked internally a lot differently than what Intel had in store. And because we've seen how Apple has made their own custom chips in the past with CPUs, most people are assuming that with Apple designing their own modems, this means in the long run they're going to end up being very, very good, if anything, comparable to the Qualcomm chips, because right now Qualcomm essentially has a monopoly on that kind of stuff, and they're exceedingly ahead of the competition, but you don't want one company that's exceedingly ahead of everybody else. Like in any situation, you want multiple companies that are very, very good at developing the individual chips or the SSDs or the displays. Competition is good because it means that they can compete against each other, try to make the better product, try to make them more affordable, and ultimately the consumer wins in the end as long as there is some genuine competition. But that being said, we're not going to see that real Qualcomm and Apple internal chip competition for probably a little while. Apple has still dropped all the legal cases they were fighting with Qualcomm, and I'm sure a lot of that bitterness is still there, and that's likely why Apple decided to buy out Intel's modem business, because they know in the end they don't want to rely on Qualcomm forever. They may be the short-term solution to make sure that we get a couple of iPhones in 2020 with 5G support. On a side note, I still think that's unnecessary. It's going to take forever for 5G to be implemented everywhere. Even if a year goes by, I still don't think it's going to be covered in most areas, and you shouldn't not buy a phone in 2020 just because it doesn't have 5G support, but that's a whole different topic. The point is, Apple's playing the long game, and they know that there's going to be cellular modems that they need to implement into other devices aside from just the iPhone. So while Qualcomm, for the next couple of years, may be designing the chips for future generation iPhones, they're more than likely going to be working on their own in-house designed cellular chips for things like the iPad Pro or things like the Apple Watch, because that's something that does not need 5G support. It's just transmitting data. This doesn't need those gigabit speeds. Arguably, nothing needs those gigabit speeds, but again, different topic, sorry. And to have them experiment on a few cellular devices that don't necessarily need to have that insane speed right away, and it's not quite the bread and butter that the iPhone is. So they're definitely going to have a few years to kind of perfect and figure out how to make reliable modems. And given how they manage their CPU team, I think they're going to do a pretty good job and hopefully take the cream of the crop, the best and most talented people of the 2,200 that they're acquiring from Intel, and putting their talents and skills to good use. Most things Apple designs internally, and I think that is their grand vision. Their end goal is that they design everything for the iPhone custom. It's all designed internally. They don't have to worry about different manufacturers or different companies assembling or producing their products. That's a long ways away because obviously they need to use Samsung displays, LG displays, oftentimes Samsung SSDs, or lots of different companies' parts to build the iPhone and make it what it is today. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they would like to design everything internally because then they can have complete control over every aspect of the phone, and buying out the Intel modem business and allowing one day for the iPhone to have its own custom cellular chips will allow them to have even more control than they have right now. Like in the past, they were buying modem chips from both Intel and Qualcomm, and because the Qualcomm chips were so much better, they had to down throttle those chips to match the speed of the Intel ones because they wanted to make sure that, you know, all the iPhones had the same performance, and you didn't just pull the luck of the draw. Oh, hey, I got the lucky Qualcomm chip version. Now my phone's faster than some other poor soul that happened to get the Intel version. That would be a PR nightmare. That would be a big mess. So if you have control over all the modems going into your phone, hopefully you can make something as good as what Qualcomm is producing, or hopefully someday even better. Give Qualcomm a run for their money and let them know that, hey, we don't need you anymore. We can design our own chips. And I'm sure Qualcomm's not very happy about this announcement either, which Apple's being very public about. They showcased it in the newsroom, meaning they want everybody to know about this, but I still don't don't think you're likely going to see an iPhone custom modem chip inside for at least another 2 years. There are some reports saying that you could see an Apple-made one by 2021. I think that's a tad ambitious, so I would say push it to maybe 2022. But in regards to perhaps next year's Apple Watch or maybe next year's iPads, those could be some of the first devices you see Apple-branded modems on, utilizing the team that they bought from Intel just a couple days ago. I'm rooting for them. I think this is a good idea, and I don't think we're just going to get more crappy modems because it's the Intel team. I think under Apple's management, they're going to make the best of it. They're going to utilize their skills and talents in good ways. And like I said before, most of the time, anything Apple does internally, it usually ends up being one of the best in the world. The CPU chips is the classic example. They design that internally, they make it themselves, and if you compare their performance to the competition, they're still way in the lead, especially with the A12 and A12X chip. The Snapdragons are just barely catching up to it now, and it's been available for 10 months, and in another 2 months, you're going to see the A13 chip, which is going to shatter all the records again, I'm sure. And this goes without saying, but of course, their operating systems, they all design internally, and the RAM management and battery efficiency they use on iPhones is far better than that of the competition. So I think it's safe to say when Apple designs things internally and they don't outsource it to a different company, they usually can get performance up to par with everybody else in the market, or sometimes exceed that and set new standards and break new records, which I'm all for seeing so that we can have more stable and reliable internet connections on the go. Full disclosure, do not expect an Apple custom chip on the 2019 iPhones. Those are already in production. They're being built right now. We know everything about them. You're not going to see Qualcomm modems on this year's iPhones as well. For anyone out there that was curious about that, most likely the first iPhone with all Qualcomm modems is going to be the 2020 iPhone. There are some reports suggesting that the 2 premium models will be 5G, and then kind of the R series, the more budget-friendly model, that will be just standard LTE. That won't get 5G, which personally, knowing how slowly 5G coverage takes, you'll probably not even utilize the 5G speeds on those new iPhones next year for a long while. But some people are buying these things for the long haul. I get it. I just think most of the things you do on your phone don't really require 5G in the first place. The majority of you are listening to music, watching videos, browsing Twitter. All of those things can be done with a good LTE connection. If you don't have very good coverage for LTE in your area, then you're definitely not going to get very good 5G coverage in your area for a long, long time. 5G is slower to implement than 4G, so all that aside, I think it's good that Apple's designing more things internally, and I want to hear from you guys. What other things or what other parts of the iPhone do you think Apple needs to start designing internally? And I'm personally hoping, since Apple's going to get good at designing their own chips and making their own custom modems for things like the iPad and the Apple Watch, maybe they could introduce an LTE-supported MacBook. A lot of people have been asking that for a long time, particularly Marquez, and we know Apple watches his videos, so why not make an LTE-equipped MacBook Pro? I think a ton of people would buy into that. Anywho, let me know your ideas by following me over on Twitter or joining our Discord. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you guys in the next one.